Hi, today we're going to be talking about how we can continuously improve our culture through the different design decisions that we make. I'm going to be talking about how we took a culture-focused look at our design for our CI/CD platform at Two Sigma. Before I get into that, we need to take a word from our sponsor, the Two Sigma legal team. So all this slide says is that I'm not giving you financial advice. Anyway, moving on. So who am I? I'm a software engineer in the SDLC team of Two Sigma. So Two Sigma is a financial sciences company based out of New York City. And the SDLC team is responsible for the software development lifecycle of the different applications at Two Sigma. So before joining Two Sigma, I sparked a big interest in DevOps. I've always been interested in that side of things, and so I got excited about the opportunity at Two Sigma. There was a team forming that was going to be working on the DevOps tools of the SDLC team, and so I was excited about the prospect of working on a tool at that scale. And I also am a big tech culture enthusiast. So I think culture is something that plays such an important role in the way we do everything. And it can sometimes be surprising how culture affects what we do every single day. And I think that's important to keep culture in mind. And that's kind of the genesis of this conversation today. So before I dive too deep into culture, I kind of want to define what it is we're talking about here. So culture at its highest level is the art and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. That's the standard definition of culture, and that's much too broad for what we're going to be talking about today. The company or an organizational culture is something that encompasses the culture of the entire organization. It's the shared values, attributes, and characteristics of that organization, but that's still a little too broad of what we're going to be talking about today. What I want to talk about is something I refer to as tech culture. It's the standard values, principles, and norms in a given community with respect to how they use technology. And I think it's important to limit that scope just down to how people use technology. Something that might be a value in tech culture is something like writing tests, right? Many of us agree that writing tests is something worth doing and something that is valuable. So when we're thinking about tech culture and how it can influence the products we write and use, we have to realize that tech culture can work against us if it's not working for us, right? So just because something is declared a best practice doesn't mean anyone's going to follow it, right? You need buy-in from those people to actually follow the best practice. So sometimes there might be a conflict between the norms and what people do on an everyday basis and what is actually a best practice. So when those two things are in conflict, tech culture can actually be hindering our ability to establish a best practice and push for some of the cultural outcomes that we think are worthwhile. Tech culture can also work for us, though, which is the good news. If the culture's norms are working for us and are in our corner, it's much easier for people to start following those best practices if people think it's valuable for them to do so. So we can benefit from an improved culture as well, where if someone else has a best practice, we can adopt that and bring it into everything we do on a daily basis. So the easy solution is to just change the culture, right? But good luck telling someone to think or behave differently. So what my proposed solution is to look at your product from a culture perspective. How does your product influence the way people think about the different values and cultural outcomes that they have? And if you do that, you can start to make technical decisions with the culture in mind that point people towards the culture that you think is desirable. So having a healthy culture is very important. So some of the things that it does is increase the shared values, right? So if I think testing is important and I convince someone else that testing is important, all of a sudden that both of us think testing is important, and those shared values create for a more productive environment. If we're both writing tests, then that's good. So if we have good values, then that is a big benefit of a healthy culture. Additionally, we can increase the adoption of a given best practice. So if we convince others that a best practice is valuable and worth doing, then the adoption of that best practice will subsequently go up. If we increase the adoption of best practices, that will increase technical cohesion. So many different people will use the same value structure to solve the same problems and end up doing something similar, right? And if you do something similar, you'll have more cohesion and be able to think about things the same way. It also decreases the principled disagreement. And principled disagreement is just the phrase I used to talk about a fundamental values-based disagreement, right? So if you and someone else are trying to figure out the best solution to a problem, the principled disagreement is not necessarily a disagreement at the solution, but it's a more fundamental disagreement about the values that both of you share. So first, we're going to talk about the OCAI types of culture. And that will provide a good framework for us to talk about the cultural outcomes later in this presentation. So what are the OCAI types of culture? So OCAI stands for the Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument. And this is developed at the University of Michigan. So there's 4 different archetypes to the OCAI model. They are create, collaborate, control, and compete. So we'll dive into these. So create culture. Their model might be do new things. They are innovators. They value the freedom of thought and action, and they're not afraid to take risks and learn from mistakes. The people who succeed in a create culture are entrepreneurs and visionaries, those who are innovative. In a collaboration culture, the model might be do things together. And collaboration cultures like to build teams and focus on human development. So naturally, if you're investing in people and developing people, then you're kind of committing to a longer term change over time. And you share a collective wisdom and help improve each other. So a person that might be a leader in this type of culture might be more of a mentor or a coach. The next one is control. So the controls model might be do things right. So control seeks to systematically eliminate errors, pay attention to detail, systematically solve problems logically, and increase reliability. And one of the more important things is to build efficient routines to a control culture. Someone who might succeed in a control culture is an organizer or an administrator of a given organization. Then there's the compete culture, or sometimes called the market culture. That one is play to win, and it can be summed up by everything is a competition, right? So it's fast change, very deadline focused, and it's important to deliver results quickly. So someone who might be a leader in a compete culture will have a high reputation for getting good results quickly. So these are the 4 archetypes of culture. Now, of course, any given tech culture won't fall into only one bucket. Each of these will be, you'll kind of see how much of a create archetype you are, or how much of a collaborate culture you are. So you can kind of use these as measurements across these 4 different archetypes. And we'll come back to these different archetypes later when we're talking about the cultural outcomes and the strategies we can use to improve the culture. So let's do another little bit of a deep dive into tech culture. So the most important thing to keep in mind with tech culture is that we want to define it as the shared values within a community that are focused on how they interact with technology. So if you place a high value on testing, for example, you might want to do test-driven development. And the shared value is valuing the importance of tests, right? Like tests are a good thing to do and a good thing to write. The cultural outcome, which is the shared behavior of the community, might be to do test-driven development or just write sufficient tests, right? That might be the cultural outcome. And the values that people share within a culture, in a community, along with the culture, which are influenced by the values, are always constantly changing, not only within the individual, but also the group as a whole. And obviously, culture can be something that's very hard to quantify. So to get the best understanding of a culture, you really kind of need to experience it. It's very easy to point at a culture and say, yes, I like this about this culture, or I don't like this aspect of this other culture. So it can be tough to actually sit down and write down what your culture is like, or something like that. And it's even harder to change, right? It is very hard to change one person's mind, never mind a whole community. So to change someone's mind, you have to convince them that a new idea is worth valuing either more highly or lower than they previously valued it. And then combine that with the pre-existing value structure that they already have to generate those cultural outcomes I was talking about. And then they have to have sufficient motivation to act differently based on those new values. So those 3 steps you need to take in order to change someone's actual behavior, right? So before we do that, we need to kind of analyze the culture, see if there are any gaps that we want to see changed, right? So the first thing that you might want to do is sit down and see how your product influences cultural outcomes. So how does your product guide people towards or away from different cultural outcomes? Are people taking shortcuts with your application to just for convenience's sake? Or what best practices do people not value high enough to actually do, right? And does your application facilitate additional exploration into the nuances of the different values that you have? So I'm not sitting here claiming that I have all of the best practices or all of the best values. I just want to be able to collaborate and learn from others on what the best values might be, and then take those values and actually put them into practice. That should be the ultimate goal of this, is not to instill your values on others, but be able to facilitate an environment for collaboration on those values. So the other thing to keep in mind when looking at culture is that actions speak much louder than words. As I've been saying before, people will say they value something, but not actually put it into practice. So what we want to look for is the values that motivate people enough so that they actually do the thing that they value. You want to look at what the people do. So, which is to look at the cultural outcomes, right? So if people are doing test-driven development, you know that the people in that community very much value testing, as the example. So what are some of the DevOps values that we want to look at as it relates to Two Sigma? So the first one is to automate everything, right? DevOps, we love automation and not having to worry about manual steps. With automation comes fast iteration. So being able to quickly do things related to DevOps is very important. We also want to embrace failure. So being not afraid to have our somewhere in the workflow, somewhere fail and be able to respond to that, which relates to the constant feedback point. We want to be able to respond to what is changing in the environment very quickly. We also want to use DevOps to be able to increase collaboration between the teammates on a given team or even other teams. And then additionally, we use it to help ensure that we have a high amount of reliability on our deployment process. So at Two Sigma in particular, we started off a little more than 2 years ago trying to make a big DevOps initiative, right? So it started off wanting to increase our automation. So, we had a lot of things automated, but not everything. There were still some manual steps in a lot of the different teams having to do things in their deployment process manually. We also wanted to increase cohesion. So at the time, there was many different tools floating around. There wasn't one ubiquitous tool that everyone was using. We also wanted to increase collaboration, which kind of goes hand in hand with cohesion. So collaboration would allow, say there's two different tools being used by two different teams. Well, all of a sudden they can't benefit from each other. But as soon as they're both using the same tool, all of a sudden they can benefit from each other and see what each other's values and share those values between the two different teams, or even just share snippets of code, right? So we also wanted to increase the frequency of deployment. So we want to be deploying more often to get that tighter feedback loop. And we also want to increase release confidence. So we want to make sure that people are confident in their release and believe in that they won't break anything based on them just releasing. So at the end, we ended up with a product called Coin. So what is Coin? So Coin stands for the first two letters of continuous integration. And basically Coin is a cohesive CI/CD platform that unifies the DevOps experience at 2 Sigma. Fundamentally, Coin is Jenkins instances hosted on Kubernetes. And we supply some tools out of the box for different teams to interact with our on-prem technologies, the ones that we use most often. So we put a high priority on giving users flexibility while still trying to promote some of those DevOps best practices that we just talked about that we wanted to increase, right? And the most important thing that we wanted to do is to continuously integrate good ideas, which is to say we want to make a place for collaboration and to improve the DevOps culture as a whole. And the best way to do that is have it permeate throughout the community naturally. So what are some of the strategies we used for improving the culture around DevOps via Coin? And I'll talk about some examples of some of the technical decisions at each step that we made. So the first one is can be best summed up by Gandhi's quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world." So this one is surrounding the idea that we want to lead by example, right? So if you live up to your own standards, you are demonstrating that the values you are telling other people, you're saying, I believe these two. Look, I'm actually putting these into practice because they are worth having. And this is, you can see it's in the bottom here, we have the OCAI, down here, we have the OCAI types that adhere to this specific strategy. So we can see that this is very prone to a community and a control-based archetype, right? So if you want to improve those dimensions, you can use this strategy. And the example from the Coin, the technical decisions that we made with Coin, the first and foremost one is dogfooding our own product, right? So we wanted to make sure that we were using our own product on to release our product, right? So it was very often, especially in the early days, that we were the ones to find out about given issues first. And, that's an important thing because it shows that not only are we putting into practice what we preach, but that we are dedicated to having a good user experience. The other thing we definitely wanted to do was to follow other best practices. So we worked with plenty of other teams at 2 Sigma, and we wanted to make sure that we were hitting their best practices to show that we, have similar values and want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. We also made a point to communicate decisions with intent and reasoning. So all this bullet point is talking about is to, when you communicate a decision, make sure that the person you're talking to knows the reasons why and the reasons behind that decision so that they can understand your value system more easily. The next point is to create incentives. So we want to make it easier for people to avoid shortcuts. Like I mentioned before, shortcuts are an easy way to avoid best practices. If something is easier to do the wrong way, some people will choose to take the easier path. So we want to make sure that people that the easiest path is the one that we hope people follow. And we want to recognize that we want to recognize when we see good behavior in line with the values that we think are valuable. So there's a study that found out that employees who don't feel recognized are twice as likely to quit their job in a year, while the top 20% of companies with a recognition-rich culture have a 31% lower turnover rate. So it just goes to show that being recognized for doing a good job and doing something valuable is something that is very motivating for employees. And you can see this probably in your everyday life. It's very easy to be motivated if you're getting recognized for something. And then another point that I've seen work in the past is that gamification can be great for some competitive people. And so the incentive structure works very much in tandem with the market/competition focus culture. So because it provides a framework for them to determine success, right? So what incentives did we provide in Coin? So the first thing we did is demonstrate value. So showing other people the value that they can achieve using Coin is a very good motivational tool, right? It's if you show off and say, hey, look what I can do at the press of a button, that is something that motivates someone to achieve that as well. We also gave CD for free, which is something that's important for users that follow the best practices of other teams at Two Sigma. We can develop CD pipelines for them for free. All they have to do is configure their application to follow a set of rules, right? And if they follow those set of rules, then we can implement a out-of-the-box CD solution for them, which is super easy. So that incentivizes following the best practices of other teams as well. Then the other thing we did was to exemplify success stories and learn from mistakes. So we wanted to demonstrate the value, like I talked about before, of the different success stories, but we also want to learn from the mistakes of people that ran into problems or something that wasn't easy. So we could show that to other teams that we have the ability to avoid those common pitfalls for them. The next strategy for improvement is very much related to the control culture, and right here. And the control culture is focused on setting those hard rules, right? The first, hard rules are about explicitly not allowing users to do the wrong thing. So take the option completely off the table. We want to enforce the best practices that we think are valuable by not allowing the user to do the wrong thing and kind of forcing the right thing. This abstracts away some of the decisions that a user might have to otherwise make and kind of forces the cultural outcomes that we want to see. The problem with this is that it doesn't necessarily promote a constructive feedback system around those values, but it does help get our best practices implemented in our application. So some of the ones that we decided to do with Coin, the first one is that we made a rule that only administrators have access to the Jenkins config. So we have a standard out-of-the-box set of Jenkins config, and only the administrators can change it. And part of that reason is it abstracts away from the intricacies of Jenkins config. We have a lot of experience with Jenkins, but the user may not. So, it provides that abstraction. But it also keeps everything relatively similar. So we don't have different Jenkins instances doing, anything that they want. We'll keep it within the set of domain things that we want. And then we also mandate that pipelines exist in source control. So it's important to have things like history and auditability for pipelines. So we mandate that all the pipelines are in source control so that it's easy to, if you see a pipeline, you know exactly where the source code is, and those two can be synced very easily. And the last point for hard rules is that the containers must be kept up to date. So we want to make sure that all of the deployments and all the applications within a given container are up to date and not stale. So we enforce that rule as well. The next point that is very important is to facilitate innovation. So this kind of goes back to the create and competition archetypes. And this allows users to have the tools to innovate. So we want to facilitate that creativity and the innovation and allow users to kind of experiment. We don't want to be too restrictive. So if we see that a user has some good ideas and has done something that maybe shifts our values a little bit, maybe we can adopt those good ideas back into the platform and see those changes spread throughout the culture that way. So some of the tools that we developed to facilitate that innovation was the integrations with our internal tools, right? So we have a internal implementation of a monorepo that works with our build and test system. So we wanted to make sure that our Jenkins as a service application could do all of these things out of the box relatively easily. So that, you may have heard the expression that we provided the Lego blocks and the users can kind of put those blocks into whatever configuration that they so choose. So we made it easy for users without taking away the agency of being able to control what they do with it. So they have that freedom for innovation there. And additionally, we have a dynamic worker environment with varying levels of customization. So users can use our out-of-the-box container images that have some standard tools in them and just call it a day and have us worry about it. Or they can provide their own custom images. And the last way they can go about it is to have a dedicated, they can connect their own hardware to Jenkins so that they run their own, maybe customized hardware, for example. And these different varying levels of customization allow the bulk amount of users to just take the easy path and follow the Kubernetes best practice of containers, while also allowing people to use dedicated specific hardware for their more hardware type tests or hardware dependent type tests, and create that range of flexibility within the worker environment. This is my favorite strategy for improvement and very much goes to the community and social aspects of culture. So building a community around the tools or applications you develop, I think, is very important. The culture spreads best through communities. That's just the way it is. Communities are, after all, a group of people with some shared values, and culture develops and changes more quickly in a community, especially one that's cohesive. So building a community can also bolster or enhance the other strategies that we're talking about here, and help facilitate and bring that conversation up more often between the people in a given community. So how do we do that with Coin? The community initiatives in Coin was first and foremost to create a discussion room in Slack. This room was not only the place that we updated people on the things that were going on with Coin, but also provided a space for people to talk about the different things that they were doing in Coin. So it gave us a great platform to talk about what we thought about Coin, but also the rest of the community could collaborate there as well. We also instilled or created a coin class. The coin class is simply just a class that someone can take to learn the ins and outs of coin, but also to learn the values in which we used to develop coin, right? So we talk a lot about the different DevOps values that I talked about earlier, so that we're all kind of on the same page about the motivation behind why you would want to use coin, for example. Then one of my favorite points is we have the user stories presentations. The user stories presentations are like a quarterly meeting we have where we invite some of our users to just give a demonstration about what cool thing they've done with coin. And this is a great way for not only us to reward some of the users that have done cool stuff, but also share some ideas within the community. There have been many productive conversations come out of that where two different teams realize they're doing something similar, and so they can kind of take notes and share within or between those two teams what they're doing. They also have a community developed extensions area, so that so last but not least, we have a community developed extensions repository where people can develop on their different extensions of Jenkins together. So if someone has a different integration that they need for a specific tool that they have, they can essentially open source that plugin or shared library to the rest of the community so that we can collaborate on those issues together. We've helped develop some of those applications in the community, but kept them as part of the community extension so that we can facilitate that sense of a community. So the next point is have a tight feedback loop, and it's tied closely to the create and community cultures. And we want to make sure that things are happening quickly, or at least keep communicating. Like I said before, we want to be communicating about the different decisions we make very early and often, and make sure that voices feel heard, right? We want to be responsive to any questions or feedback that we receive, whether that response be a, actually like talking response, or a response via actually implementing a feature or making a fix. So the other thing we want to keep in mind when we're having this feedback loop is that we don't want to just take requests at face value. So if people say, hey, we want feature A, we implement feature A. We want to first understand the root cause. The root cause of a request might point to a differentiation in the values that you and the other person requesting whatever it is have. So it's important to keep that in mind when taking requests. So how do we address this in Coin? We communicated early and often, as I talked about, especially related to feature requests. We had CD, which is also important, not to push DevOps too much, but CD is important for us to be able to iterate quickly and get our changes out there in a fast and effective way. We also made a big effort to collect feedback and have release notes so people know what's going on in the Coin world. And we also measured adoption so we can see how many teams are actually using Coin and hopefully what they're using it for. So the next strategy is very create culture focused, and it's to actually measure the impact of what is going what is going on in the culture. So you want to know if your cultural outcomes are improving or not, and where those values are. Proving that cultural outcomes are improving is a great way to prove value to stakeholders, whether that be management or other users, right? And it helps you also view and see other culture gaps that might exist that you didn't think about before. And if you identify those, maybe you can address those as well. So some of the ways we decide to measure impact, first and foremost, there's the famous DevOps metrics, which are in the Accelerate book. I highly recommend it if you haven't picked it up. But those metrics are lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to restore, and change fail percentages. And what those metrics do is kind of give you a good sense on how DevOpsy a team is. So if we can measure those metrics, we can see how much they value those values that we've tried to push for. We also created a dashboard out of the box that helps track releases and how often releases are happening, so that teams have a very real view into actually what is changing with their application, when it's changing, how often it's changing. And having that measurement and seeing those actually change is very beneficial to those users to reinforce those DevOps ideas. So what happened at the end of the day with Coin? How did that cultural impact affect the environment? So, like I said before, tech culture can work for us. In the case of Coin, we wanted to get that DevOps culture up. We wanted to improve the automation, and so if we make the technical decisions, like the ones that I talked about earlier, and help facilitate that cultural improvement, we can see that the tech culture can work on our side and hopefully improve over time. Like I said, the technical decisions we made before can help point people towards the culture that we found valuable, right? So the DevOps culture is something that is definitely valuable, but it takes convincing of users to actually facilitate that change in a more broad sense. And through changing that culture, we can see and very readily recognize the benefits of having that culture shifted. So like I said, increase of the shared values of DevOps. We can see a higher adoption of the DevOps best practices, and the technical cohesion of Coin is very high because Coin is the central repository for all things DevOps at 2 Sigma. And so we can see some of Coin's success. We have 90 plus instances of Jenkins running in Kubernetes with 1,300 plus pipelines. And since Coin has been around, we've seen at least a 10x increase in deployment frequency. And now we have at least 40,000 tests running a day. And I just want to make a quick note that is just like integration type tests that are running in Coin. That doesn't include our unit tests that run in our test farm. So running all those tests is great for the instilling of the DevOps practices as well as the release confidence that people have in their products. So overall, Coin has been a great experience for me because it allowed me to take that cultural view and see that cultural shift happen over the past few years that I've been at 2 Sigma. So thank you so much for listening to my talk. I appreciate it very much. If you want to connect with me at all, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can ask me a question there or message me there. Thank you so much and have a good one.